Good morning on this Sunday, June 5th, and welcome to the Georgia Gang. Secretary of State Brad Raffensberger testifies before a Fulton grand jury investigating whether anyone, including former President Trump, illegally interfered with the 2020 election. Also, DeKalb County is still counting ballots by hand after technical problems with voting machines, and Atlanta Mayor Andre Dickens announces his summer safety plans. Melita, Theron, and Martha are all here. We welcome back Brian Robinson, who's filling in for Phil. The debate and discussion begin right now.
From the Fox 5 studios, the Georgia Gang starts now.
Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensberger was the first subpoenaed witness to testify in front of a special purpose grand jury investigating whether anyone, including former President Donald Trump, should face charges for trying to influence the results of the 2020 election. Secretary of State Brad Raffensberger was all smiles as he entered the Fulton County Courthouse Thursday, waved to reporters but didn't take any questions. Fulton County impaneled 23 jurors and 3 alternates for the grand jury last month. The proceedings are secret, but Raffensberger's testimony likely centered around a phone call made by then President Donald Trump to Raffensberger in January of 2021. During that call, President Trump appeared to urge Raffensberger to change the results.
I just want to find 11,780 votes, which is one more than we have.
Secretary Raffensberger spoke to the I-Team's Dale Russell Wednesday.
Would you tell them that you felt pressured by the president?
I heard what the president said, and I understand that he has tremendous positional power, but I also know that we followed the law and we followed the Constitution.
Secretary Raffensberger's wife also appeared before the grand jury on Thursday. Like her husband, she received death threats in the wake of the 2020 election. Martha, what are we to take from all of this? Do you think we could see some indictments come from this?
I think it's possible, although I've got to hear everything that's said as far as the witnesses are concerned. But first of all, no one should ever get death threats for doing their job. That should never happen. And I think it's going to be interesting to see how all this plays out. And I think Secretary Raffensberger appeared, and I think that this is going to go forward.
And Theron, we're going to see a lot of Brad Raffensberger's staff also. They've been subpoenaed to testify. So what do you make of all of this?
Well, I think first of all, Fani Willis is doing what she said she was going to do. There was an article this week that said while she is moving forward with this case of investigating, which I believe is a very corrupt former president, and clearly the evidence shows that he did this and he just got caught, and Brad Raffensberger just had the sense enough to actually record the conversation. But I do think that I agree with Martha, there may be indictments, they may come down. I'm really interested to hear what the staff will say, but ultimately I think it reminds the Georgia voters of what we have now versus what we used to have in President Trump.
Brian.
I think anything having to deal with President Trump, the 2020 election, is more of a national issue than a Fulton County issue. And doesn't Fulton County have some crime issues that it perhaps should be focusing on? This revolving door we've had with criminals, particularly over the last 2 or 3 years. We have some serious systemic problems. That should be the focus. But what is this Democrat DA doing in this scenario? She is reminding voters that Brad Raffensberger and his staff, who will also testify, as you said, stood up for election integrity, that they didn't do what President Trump wanted them to do. They're reminding voters of why they liked him. Even the Republican primary voters ratified Raffensberger's actions. The broader electorate is going to be even more receptive to it, and Fani Willis is reminding them of that.
Melita.
Well, I think the ratification of Raffensberger was aided by a high crossover Democratic vote, number one. But I think it was interesting that Raffensberger told Fox 5 earlier in the week that he wasn't nervous about testifying in front of the grand jury because he had followed the law and followed the Constitution. So I think perhaps there will be some indictments, and I do think that Fani Willis is appropriately pursuing this because Fulton County is the seat of government for Georgia, and it was the governmental authorities of Georgia who were being threatened by the former president.
Well, and I think also Secretary of State Raffensberger, he's a problem solver, right, by trade. He's an engineer. So it's kind of what we said before, like this is who you want as a Secretary of State.
Well, I mean, he might have had a slow start at the beginning of his term, which I think that he did, and obviously no one could foresee how COVID was going to impact elections and that kind of thing, but I think what we saw on primary day is that he has demonstrated to the Republican primary voter that he can fix problems, and that he is an engineer, and he's kind of a gearhead, and he's going to approach this kind of unemotionally. I don't know what ultimately is going to happen and who's going to run against him in November, but I think he's way ahead right now because of that.
But then we can count on the fact that those Democrats aren't going to vote for him in November.
No, but you know, while this Secretary of State Raffensberger parade continues, we're going to get into some topics later on in the show that may actually rain on that parade. But I want to push back on something Brian said. You know, it's interesting to me. We come on the show every week, and what's been the consistent theme about this DA? She's tough on crime. She's locking criminals up. She's decreasing the backlog. So to say that she's not or inferring that she's not focusing on that, Brian doesn't like when I misquote him, is basically just false. She can do both at the same time. Quite frankly, she got a lot of criticism, Brian, for waiting so long to actually pursue this investigation. So to infer that she's not doing her job as far as crime, I think that's just blatantly false, because if you look at the gang activity is going down, arrests are up, morale is higher. She's actually hiring good staff in the DA's office. And so I think that was a Republican spin. Now, the other thing I would say about this, I think the difference is this. Brad Raffensberger took the call, but he was smart enough to protect himself. But what we don't know is calls that maybe led up to that call, because we know that this former president had a history of bullying people, whether you're on the Republican side or Democratic side, to try to get you to do what he wanted you to do.
Brian first, hold on, if you want to respond.
Well, you know, there is some calls on the record beyond just that one call. There were calls to election officials in the office from the president as well. So my thing with Fani Willis is, I just don't think that this is the right venue for this case to be pursued. This is more of a federal issue to me, not something that Fulton County should be expending resources on. I just don't think it's a smart expenditure of resources.
Melita?
I think it is a smart expenditure of resources because Georgia officials need to be protected from federal bullying. And the president, the former president, the twice impeached former president, has such a history of bullying behavior, and I'm thrilled to see Fani Willis standing up to that behavior.
Real quickly.
Quickly, the Democratic talking point is that these crossover voters are going to go back to the Democratic side in November. That's just hopeful talking. They don't know if that's going to happen, and they're concerned about it.
Well, let's turn it to the governor's race, where the ads are already heating up. The One Georgia Leadership Committee going after Governor Kemp for his stances on guns and abortion. Brian, how difficult are these issues for Kemp, especially when it comes to the female voters?
Well, if you look at the abortion issue, let's start with that. The voters themselves are not with the Democrats or the Republicans. They don't want a ban or, you know, really tight restrictions, but they also don't want what Washington Democrats voted for a few weeks ago, which went way beyond Roe v. Wade and would have basically legalized late-term abortions around the entire country. Voters aren't there either. And so Republicans are going to have to make that case. That's what we're talking about. It's not just about what Republicans are going to do. It's also about what Democrats would do if they had the power to do it. Now, I think that the criminal carry messaging that Abrams is doing around the gun issue is probably pretty smart, but we haven't seen the gun issue, other than perhaps Lucy McBath's race, really play a major role in general elections in Georgia at this point.
But we just had an elementary school massacre, and I will say even Jeff Duncan came out and said, you know, maybe it is time to look at the 18 to 21-year-olds. Do they really need access to these semi-automatic weapons? Melita.
Well, I think you make a great point, because this latest massacre of school children makes everybody look at guns again. And the majority of these school shootings have been 18-year-olds disaffected who have access to these weapons of war, which even in the military, to carry these weapons, it requires at least 3 weeks of training. And so the idea that these weapons of war are widely available to teenagers is totally ludicrous, and I do believe the American people on both sides of the aisle are fed up with that concept.
So Martha, is this a smart strategy then for Abrams?
I think it'll work out fine right now, but I think both of these issues separate more not just women voters, but it's whether you're a single woman voter or you're a woman with children voter, and they split different ways, don't they, depending on how it is. So I think it's a good ad for right now, okay? It is an issue, but of course the governor has passed lots of legislation that has done more things for school safety and that have been implemented over the last 3 years. So that's what he's answering with right now. We're not going to have a special session or anything like that, because everybody, it seems like the flavor of the day is to ask for a special session no matter what it is. It won't be a special session. In January, I suspect something will be taken up, and I think the age limit is something that people can get on board
I
about.
think there's some compromise there, Theron.
Well, the fact that we're talking about it, and we can't forget what happened in Uvalde, but also what happened in Buffalo. I'm going to say it week after week. People literally were targeted by a person who obtained not one gun, but guns. And to Melita's point, these were weapons, that people used and wore, and literally went into a grocery store and only killed black people. And so I think that what the Abrams campaign is doing is, one, just highlighting some issues. And I've been saying this, the difference between the general election and the primary election is that, one, she's going to have much more money to be more poignant in her attacks. But I do think that I agree with Martha and I agree with Brian and Melita that I think this age limit thing is something we can actually talk about and actually have some hopeful compromise on it.
I think that her One Georgia theme gives her a broad umbrella that she can bring up a lot of contrasting issues for the 20 years of Republican control Georgia has, and the many contrasts on how she would do things as compared to how the Republicans have done things.
Brian, last word.
She has got an immense amount of money to be pouring into TV ads at this time of the year, where this is sort of a break in that they're talking about issues. For the most part, they have been warm and fuzzy, here's who I am bio ads, which I thought was a little confusing because Georgians know who she is. She does not need to introduce herself to us. So I think finding some of these issues where she can get the middle, where she is going to lose in this environment, she's got to go find those voters, and that's the strategy.
We'll leave it there, everybody. Thank you. Coming up, the DeKalb County Board of Elections is hand counting votes from 40 precincts after technical issues. We'll discuss straight ahead.
Have a question or comment for the Georgia Gang? Email them at georgiagang@foxtv.com.
DeKalb County is reporting a slew of technical problems when it comes to counting ballots for the District 2 commission race. 3 candidates are vying for the nomination. The data shows candidate Michelle Long Spears received no votes on Election Day, even at the precinct where she voted for herself. Theron, what's going on here?
So this is complicated. I'll do my best to explain. So first and foremost, there were 4 candidates initially running for the District 2 race. You had a candidate drop out of the race. And so before that person dropped out, you had people went in and voted early, and then day of election voting. So Michelle Long Spears basically said, hey, I went to my precinct and others went and voted for me, but it's basically not showing up. What I'm hearing, Lori, is that this was a technical issue that started with the voting machines, obviously, and the entity that's responsible for making sure that the coding and the algorithms are correct is the Secretary of State's office. Now, what happened to DeKalb County, while this is not a good look, they immediately took this serious claim very seriously, and the only way that you can actually do what they did was to actually go back and count the votes by hand. And so this is a recount that at least gives some type of clarity on what happened, but ultimately I think you got to make sure that going forward, that if there are problems with the voting machine, particularly when a candidate drops out, and then it's left up to these counties to take these claims very seriously. The other thing I would say is this: before Senate Bill 202 was introduced, counties had 10 days of due diligence, right? And that's why you always make sure the elections are quote unquote not certified. With Senate Bill 202, you only have 4 days. And so I want to commend the people who went in during the weekend to the late hours of the day and early hours of the morning to make sure that these votes are recounted, because they had a very short deadline to try to basically bring some clarity to the situation.
Brian, does this give credence to the critics of Georgia's voting machines?
We've never had an election in the history of elections where there wasn't some glitch somewhere. This is a state with 11 million people, 159 separate elections essentially in each county. And I don't know all the details that Theron does on this, but I will say this: if it is an issue with the Secretary of State's office, we have seen a record established that they will communicate through it. that they will not run and hide, that they will hold a news conference if they have to and explaining everything that happened and how they're going to fix it. They have been rock solid on that. Of course there's a problem. The important thing here is, what is the response? Are they going to fix it?
All right, I want to turn to the runoffs. Just a reminder, early voting, can you believe it, starts June 13th. The runoff is June 21st. We've talked so much about Republicans, so let's turn to Democrats. Melita, Stacey Abrams endorsed Charlie Bailey in the lieutenant governor's race over Kwanzaa Hall. Surprised?
Not necessarily, because she helped persuade him to get out of the Attorney General's race and into the Lieutenant Governor's race to begin with. So I'm not surprised at that. And also, she would want a diverse ticket on the Democratic side of the ballot. But it'll be very interesting to see how this shakes out, because Kwanzaa Hall does have a lot of name recognition in the metro area, which is the largest voting bloc in the state.
That's what I was going to ask you, Theron. Kwanzaa Hall does have, I mean, he was former congressman for a couple weeks.
Yeah. But 30 days.
Yes, but he does have name ID.
He does, and this is a tough one. I mean, Melita and I both know both of these gentlemen very well. I mean, to start with Charlie Bailey, look, getting the endorsement of Stacey Abrams, that's a big deal, right? And he definitely sent it out far and wide. But you got to also know that Kwanzaa Hall has definitely run a really effective campaign, capitalizing on his years of service on the school board, city council, and brief stint as a member of Congress. I believe that it's really going to be simple. Who can raise the money the quickest, and then who can actually get their coalition of voters out? And I assume that to match the Stacey Abrams endorsement, Kwanzaa Hall has probably got to pull out some big guns. Whoever he has, that he's been holding to come out and to endorse, I think you'll see that person, he or she, come very soon.
That'll be an interesting one to watch. Well, over to Republicans. I heard a radio ad for Jake Evans this week calling Rich McCormick a rhino, Martha.
Oh, gee, I wish I had a nickel for every time I've been called that. Okay, so look, it's going to be a dirty race, okay? It's going to be an all-attack ad race because it's a short window. And so Rich McCormick has answered back with an ad about Jake Evans and some quotes from some articles that he wrote for journals, I guess when he was in law school or something like that. They've been a few years about critical race theory and things like that. So I guess Jake is worse than a rhino. He is a guy that is worse than a rhino, whatever that is. So I think it's going to be a very interesting race to watch. That one, along with the 10th District one, I'm going to be bringing the popcorn in like Theron does and going to be watching that.
Real quickly, Brian, let's talk about the 10th. Vernon Jones, who spoke at the NRA conference after the elementary school shooting, has the backing of former President Trump over Mike Collins. What are you watching specifically in this race? Because this is an entertaining one.
Boy, is it. And, you know, this really is a great metric of Trump's enduring legacy and impact in an open seat race. Now, that's where we've seen his power be most effective.
In rural Georgia.
In rural Georgia, but also in open seat races. Mm-hmm. You know, if you look at the statewide races, that was where his guys won, was in open seats. So I thought Vernon overperformed in the first round. I actually thought Mike Collins, in the polling that we had seen previously here at Fox 5, did have Collins in a higher position than where he ended up. So it's very competitive, and the electorate in this runoff is going to be very different. Mm-hmm. As Melita said, there were independents and Democrats flooding into the Republican primary. I highly doubt they're coming back for any of these races.
Not
right?
in the 10th.
So it's going to revert to form. You're going to have a much more conservative electorate in these Republican primaries, and that's why the Trump endorsement really matters.
All right, we'll leave it there. Coming up, Atlanta Mayor Andre Dickens announces his plans for summer safety. We'll talk about that right after the break.
Join the discussion on the Georgia Gang Facebook page and watch past episodes on the Georgia Gang YouTube channel.
Atlanta Mayor Andre Dickens appointed the assistant police chief to interim police chief as the nationwide search to replace the retiring Rodney Bryant continues. Martha, what did you think of this decision and the mayor's summer safety plan? Is it enough?
I don't know if it's going to be enough or not, depending on if it works, but it had to be done. It had to be done now because Atlanta's being in the news for all the wrong reasons. You know, the highest rent, the highest inflation rate, the highest crime rates, all this kind of stuff. And I know that Andre Dickens doesn't want to do that because he wants to get results just like the next guy does, right? So I think that it was a good thing to do. We'll see if it works, but there's a lot of factors out of his control that are impacting the problems with safety.
And this is a priority for the mayor.
It is.
It's a top priority. We know that the stats show that crime increases in every city, not just in Atlanta, even in Hall County where you're from, in Gainesville, during the summertime, right? And it's primarily folks who are of the age between 14 and 21. And so what the mayor's been doing proactively, Lori, is that he started with this program called Midnight Basketball. And don't worry, they don't play basketball at midnight. I had to clarify that myself. But between the evening hours, it's basically getting a lot of community people together to play basketball. He's also, I think, been very clear about his specific issues with crime and being smart on crime. And also he uses the term to make sure that he has a safe summer plan, but basically, you know, it's a little different because he's communicating before the summer starts. And he's also sending a message to criminals saying, hey, we're going to beef up as much as we can. We know where these crimes are actually going to happen. And so I think that the mayor is continuing to show that public safety is his #1 priority.
And I want to turn to another topic that's really a priority for him too, a delay in the efforts to redevelop the Atlanta Civic Center after one of the contractors, Tishman Speyer, pulled out. H.J. Russell and company still involved. I'll go back to you, Theron, or Melita, if you want to weigh in also. What's going on? Because we're talking about a big affordable housing project.
Yeah, this one is really kind of bizarre. In full disclosure, you know, I'm not in the deal, but I know a lot of people that are in this deal. And the thing about the Civic Center, which, you know, has been a staple of the Atlanta community for so long, we've been trying to redevelop it. But for this developer, for whatever reason, I'm sure it was a good reason to kind of pull out. I just want to commend Jerome Russell and Michael Russell and Danae Russell and H.J. Russell, because what they're saying is, hey, Atlanta Housing Authority, hey, City of Atlanta, give us an opportunity to basically rectify this. And I know that the mayor and his administration is very disappointed that this happened in Atlanta Housing Authority, because this will be a big portion of the affordable housing goal that he has for the city.
Melita.
Well, and this is a 19-acre site that's prime real estate. And so I feel certain that something will come together. It just won't be with this particular developer. But this is a high priority for the mayor, and affordable housing is incredibly necessary given other things that are happening in the housing market.
Well, we'll move on. Thanks in part to some student journalists. I love that.
Yes.
They got action. DeKalb County High School is finally getting a major facelift. Brian, it took the board more than 3 tries and a threat from the state to get action here.
Yes. And the board, which has been dysfunctional for as long as any of us can remember, and please God, can't we come, I'm a DeKalb County resident, can't we just come together and get a good board in place? They fired their superintendent, blaming her for these problems when they had taken over the spending authority in the county. So we still have an ongoing problem. I'm glad that this is getting fixed. I know the community school, where in my neighborhood, needs major renovations as well. There's a lot more work to be done. I am not happy with where we are in DeKalb education.
Martha, you're on the state school board.
I'm on the state school board. I was part of that letter that kind of pushed them a little bit. Look, DeKalb County has had a lot of issues, and I think that it's the beginning of fixing those issues. But I think if I remember back in the Deal administration, they had to step in and do some fixing.
We had to replace the entire board.
The entire board. So this seems to be an ongoing problem, and people should not look at school board positions as your starting position in politics, because it's hard work, and it's a lot more work than you think it is.
Theron.
So we got to step in here a little bit. And, you know, while, yes, there has been some Republican input, before this video was taken by these students who were very, you know, efficient at getting it out, there was plans and money allocated to basically do these improvements. What happened is that the improvements just did not happen quick enough. So I kind of want to push back on this narrative that, oh, Republicans are coming in to save the day in DeKalb. And you have had some chance. No, but that's kind of, you know, what you guys are inferring.
We're here to serve, if that's
No,
right.
no,
We're here to serve.
No, you're here to serve. But my point is that, you know, Superintendent Michael Thurman and Superintendent Watson Harris, they all did some really good things. How they managed COVID, over communicating with the parents, making sure that, you know, student enrollment is up, making sure that, you know, principals and people felt safe going back to schools. And so these are all things that they did. But you did have this issue with the board, and it is at times dysfunctional. But I think ultimately people's hearts are in the right place. And so while, yes, you did have this letter from the state, but ultimately I think that DeKalb County knew, based on what Michael Thurman had been saying, that they had to get their act together.
Well, if Michael Thurman were still the school superintendent, they wouldn't be in this problem. But
Amen.
he's more needed as the CEO.
Absolutely.
We all can agree on that.
Yes.
All
Love
right,
Michael
we'll be back, everyone, with winners and losers. Stay tuned.
Time now for the week's winners and losers.
We'll start with Melita.
Thank you. Mayor Andre Dickens has been promoting a 2022 Atlanta Youth Engage program that's providing 3,000 jobs to youth age 14 to 24. These are $14 an hour jobs, and I think that's a great program, and I make him a winner. My loser is Daniel Defense, the highly profitable Georgia company, which is targeting their ads for assault rifles to teenagers. And decades ago, we decided in this country we wouldn't advertise alcohol and cigarettes to teenagers. Maybe it's time to look at that again.
Brian?
My winner is tonight, Monday and Tuesday. Georgia is hosting the biggest economic development trade mission since the '96 Olympics here in Atlanta. 250 Belgian companies and Princess Astrid of Belgium are coming here, and they're coming to here, New York, and Boston. It shows you the league that we are in. We are the #1 state for business, even if Stacey thinks we're the worst to live in. And second, Butch Miller, who in his concessions letter, he was one of my clients for disclosure, called on all nominees to vow to accept the election results this November for the good of our state. Thank you, Butch, for doing that.
Theron?
My first winner is going to be Alicia Thomas Searcy, who won her contested Democratic primary for state school superintendent without a runoff. And then secondly, I want to thank Chief Rodney Bryant, outgoing chief, 35 years of service for the Atlanta Police Department. Thank him for his service. And also I want to recognize interim chief, Darren Sherbaum, who is basically a very well-respected officer within the force. He said he wanted to focus on public trust, wanted to be smart on crime, and he wanted to uplift the men and women of the Atlanta Police Department. So I'm looking for big things from Chief Sherbaum.
Sounds good. Martha?
My winner this week is Kelly Loeffler. She wrote a great op-ed about agriculture, and I love the way she's staying involved and really doing great work as far as agriculture and getting out the vote and that kind of thing. And then my loser's got to be President Biden for his tone deafness on the economy. He doesn't understand how it works, and he doesn't understand how to fix it.
All right. Well, we'll leave it there, everybody. Thank you. And thank you so much for watching. We will see you again next week. Bye-bye.